Welcome back to the Integrate Intelligently podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Brickler. Today, I'm joined by two distinguished guests, our founder and CEO, Scott Brickler, and Mike Halladay, solution consultant from Arena PLM, a PTC product. Today, we're going to talk about PLM Decoded, what manufacturers need to know. So by the end of this conversation, you'll be able to understand what PLM does, whether your organization needs one, how Arena fits into that puzzle, and how AI is changing the game for PLM and manufacturers who use PLM. So, Mike, thanks for joining. Scott, good to see you again.
And looking forward to the conversation. That looks like it's going to be a good one.
So, Mike, one of the things that was difficult for me when I joined this industry was all the three-letter words: ERP, PLM, PDM, EMS, MES. Excuse me. And even when I talk to manufacturing companies or engineers, even they get confused a lot of times. I'll hear people throw around these terms, especially PLM and PDM, interchangeably. They don't really know the difference, and it can be overwhelming because I get it. Like, what's the difference? They all have distinct use cases. But today, our goal is to really define what each of those does. You spent over 20 years like in engineering and manufacturing and PLM. So really looking forward to, for your perspective, understanding where PLM fits and with your engineering background, what engineers need to know, but also what companies need to know.
Yeah, so it's easy, obviously just because of the similarity of PDM, PLM, that's the one you tend to get the most confusion about. PDM though is focused on CAD data, and typically your PDM system is specifically for managing the files that you generate in the CAD system that you have. PLM fits downstream from CAD, and its purpose is to take all of the data that you generate that define your products in one place. So you hear the term single source of truth all the time. And then there's a lot of ways you can define single source of truth, but PLM is your single source of truth that defines your product.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I remember when I was looking at it, I always wondered, because as you might expect, we work in the ERP space, and ERP will say the same thing, right? The ERP will say the same thing about the single source of truth.
I know. Yeah, I think
So what are some of
the what Jeff's saying is like
pain points?
Is it like there's
Mike,
sorry, go ahead, Jeff. You froze there for a second.
Okay. So, Mike, what are some of the pain points that people, obviously ERP would say the same thing, that, they're a single source of truth. And I think that is true for certain things. But what are the pain points that customers would have when they're like trying to get a PLM, right? Because we talked about PDM, that's kind of file version control, but what other, that's PDM, but what is a PLM trying to solve for customers that like ERP or PDM wouldn't solve?
ERP can be considered the single source of truth, right? Because for what you're producing today, ERP should have the truth about what your product is, so that they can start to execute on that and transact on that information. However, what you need in ERP, which is your production system, is only the data that's relevant to production today, right? Because you don't want any confusion, or you don't want to be producing to a revision that's superseded or to data that isn't complete. So PLM is the system that you use for all of your work in process. As you go from the last producible revision of your product to the next producible revision of your product, and you do it on that work in process, PLM is the home for that kind of activity. And that just, a lot of times you hear in industry a lot of talk about eliminating silos. Sometimes you need silos, right? And that's because we don't want work in process, incomplete data in ERP for just simply because of the risk that somebody might try to produce against something that's not.
So one of the things I noticed, as you probably noticed this too, that ERPs try to add functionality to get around this, right? Because they get customers who ask, and manufacturing companies have to have an ERP, right? There's no way around that. They got to manufacture. What does a PLM do especially well? I mean, it is a collector for all the data, but I mean, I saw from this, I'm sure Scott does too, in terms of I talk to customers and we see a lot of ERPs. What does PLM do especially well, that where setting aside the risk of making a work in process, which is a big risk, what are some of the other things that PLM can do that ERP typically doesn't do?
Yeah,
doesn't do well?
Architecturally, ERP is a transaction system, right? It takes a set of data, transacts against it. PLM is a revision control system, right? at its heart, at its core, it's revision
Okay.
control. So trying to patch in some concept of revision control into ERP isn't typically very successful. Plus, they don't typically manage like the revision history, right? Because, all you want is access to the latest, right? What's producible today. PLM, I have the full revision history. I can go back to any revision. I can make comparisons between revisions, and I have the mechanisms to control the release of changes as well, right? So it's a change control system. You develop, you do your work in process. You reach a milestone where you think we're ready for production on this thing, and you take all of that data, that whole record that you've compiled in PLM, and route it for approval. Once it's approved, it's released and becomes effective. That's typically the point where you transfer that information to ERP as the next producible rev of the product.
Just as a follow-up question on that, like one of the things we've noticed, just a lot of the customers we've worked with over the years is like we tend to see more PLM around like engineer to stock or engineer to order, not less. We see it less with engineer to order companies and more with engineer to stock products that are more like kind of like a model year type of format where there's like a design and then you're making another version of it next year. And there's a lot of data and compliance around that product. Whereas like a traditional ETO, engineer to order company, like a lot of times the PLM ends up being a lot of overhead for them. Is that been a similar experience for you, or is it, or
It just
you
it
have something completely
depends,
different?
right? You get into some of the nuances of products, right? And especially products with a lot of variance within the definition of the product. If you have a highly or infinitely variable product, which means that you've got infinite numbers of variations that you could produce, you will likely never produce most of them, right? Simply because nobody's ever going to order some of those variants that are possible. Typically, somewhere in the mix, you're going to have a configurator. PLM is still relevant in that scenario, right? Because PLM becomes the foundation for the data that you send to the configurator that then you apply rules to for the configurability of the product, right? And then you configure it for an order in the configurator, and the configurator sends that to ERP, right? So in those situations, configurator sits between PLM and ERP. In other situations where you have a finite number of configurations that are possible, and let's just put a number on it, let's say less than 100 configurations possible in a product, you could probably do that in PLM and avoid the cost of a configurator and the setup of the configurator and writing all the rules for the configurator. So differentiate between the number of potential configurations and the benefit of having that configurator in the mix.
What about like true project-based work, like true ETO, like where they're literally building a design
So
for a customer?
a lot of what you get with an ETO system is you design it once, produce a billion of them, never revise it, right? And then you go on to the next year's model. Or if it's ETO, this one customer has a very unique setup. They've got all these specs. You engineer to that. Where PLM can fit, and let's say that it's a very complex product, a lot of subsystems, and as you engineer to order, you're reusing a lot of the subsystems that you built or used in the last order. PLM is still relevant to all
Mm-hmm.
of those subsystems that you maintain, that you do redesign on, you do revision control on, you re-release as you develop against that. The actual end engineer to order piece is, if you keep those subsystems in PLM, you're likely to do that final product release in PLM as well. But the higher relevancy is in the subsystems that you're maintaining in the system.
Hey, that makes sense. Like, yeah, because what we see is like, it's very rarely we see true ETO companies. You see some kind of a hybrid of like they're doing project-based work, but off of base assemblies they've had in the past or base designs they've had in the past. So we've seen that as well. So it sounds like just like you mentioned earlier, which I think was a key point, is like it's really a revision tracking system, like keeping track of the changes, and like which when you're like, obviously there's a lot of changes on the engineering and the product side. Like, and one of the things that we've dealt with and we're actually working with too is around the idea of like, when does a change is kind of that change process or the engineering change process, when does it kind of cross the boundary from PLM into ERP? Because I mean, obviously if you change something in the design, you're tracking all of that on the PLM side, but it does affect things on the ERP side, the production side, right? So like kind of what's been
So
your experience around that?
in Arena specifically, And in most PLM systems, you have different categories of changes. Some of those categories of changes are relevant to
Mhm.
ERP, some of them are not. So you have changes where there's no material change to the product, doesn't change the design, doesn't affect ERP. You don't release those to ERP. You just update some kind of a minor rev of the product itself. But ERP stays the same. They produce the same, but maybe it was some correction in documentation. Some of that documentation may need to find its way to the shop floor with production instructions or something like that. But otherwise, the definition of the product stays relatively the same. But when it is a material change to a product, you definitely need a formal revision control process where you're doing robust review of the new definition of the product and all of the collaterals that go along with it. And once you secure those approvals, then it releases and those new revisions of the product become effective. That's the transfer point to ERP.
Okay. And that's what kind of where all the
Right.
dispositions of like, this is what we do with all the stuff that we have in process
Yeah,
and
if you
all that
take the
kind of
list
stuff
of
has to be
items
dealt with.
that are
Yeah. It's like,
affected by the change, you would also associate dispositions with those items. How that affects inventory, how that affects what's in stock, how it affects what's on order. And that, is captured and communicated with ERP as well, those dispositions. Yeah.
typically where Arena
Arena stops
stops there
there.
though, right?
Arena
They're kind of
has
like,
a
this is what
single
happened.
effective date for a release. And so I always like
Mhm.
to differentiate the effective date of the product. That's when it was reviewed and approved and became effective. And then cut-in dates on the ERP side where, if you've got to use up on inventory, that's going to be somewhere in the future.
Okay. So yeah, it makes sense. It's like, so once again, we're kind of translating from an engineering perspective to or for design perspective or product perspective to a production perspective. Kind of have these two kind of this, because you might approve the design on the first of the month, but you're not going to actually integrate it into your production line until another 2 months later because you have old
Totally.
inventory to move through, that kind of thing that you have to deal with. So that's interesting. Cool. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, one thing this is so how do you know when it's going to be phased in, right? How do you know when I made this change effective today, but we got to use up old inventory? Like some system would have to figure out when you would run,
Yeah. Great
Yeah.
point.
consume that inventory.
So first and foremost, hopefully you've got production folks involved in the review and approval process that are helping you make a determination on those inventory dispositions in the first place. But then they're also helping you with implementation tasks, right? And an implementation task is very useful in this case where we specify in an implementation task that somebody needs to perform the task of calculating that date out in the future and applying it in ERP because PLM's finished with this process. So we have a list of tasks that need to be performed, and we track those tasks. And so, in the workflow for PLM, you've got effective, but you also have a further status called complete. That's when everybody's finished their implementation tasks and completed that change order.
That's separate though from the disposition,
Right.
like what we're going to do in ERP, right? Because when you cut that over and you say, we're going to do it 2 months from now, one, it would seem like there would be some need to figure out like
Mhm.
what that would be, make that easier. It's like to figure out like what we're going to do over here. I mean, yes, you can get people involved, but how do you figure that out? I mean, there's got to be some kind of tooling or something to figure out
Mhm.
when I'm going to run out of that. And then when you do cut it over, like, what are you going to do with like in process jobs? Or work orders, things are on the shop floor now. Are you just going to keep going on that path and just wait till that inventory is run out? Because not everything's in inventory. Like at least the customers I talk to, some things are
Mhm.
just make to order. Like they're what I'm saying, like they ship them over there, and it's like now make this thing
Right. Yeah,
this
you
new
got lead
way.
times to consider and
Yeah.
things that are made to order for sure. That impacts when it
Yeah,
cuts in to the production. So yeah, there are a lot of considerations, which is
you give a mix of that too. A mix of give a mix of like make this thing's made to order, but these things are just
like,
the old inventory we want to use. Like that could
yeah,
get really
inventory
messy pretty
side, it's,
fast.
Mm.
mostly we're talking about off the shelf, used from stock. But in made to order items, you would also stock into inventory as they're produced and shipped to you. Also consideration, but a different, very different way of handling that than you do, off the shelf components. However, all of that is downstream from me, and I'm not an expert in how that's handled on their end. I'm just an
Right.
expert in how we
Yeah.
signal to them that these are the requirements for this new revision.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Totally. That's
So
like, it sounds like, I mean, just like that, the idea of like I mean, I think it was very clear when you originally as being that kind of change management system on the design itself or on the product. I mean, in a sense, the product lifecycle management, it's like the product oriented side of the business. And as you mentioned, with ERP is more
Mhm.
transactional against the product definition. So like things that are in process or things that the dispositions tend to fall more on the transactional side because the product has been decided. Like they went through an approval process. Yes, this is the new design. This is the new thing this is the new product that we care about. Now, like phase this into your production process. And that's kind of a separate thing.
That
Is
is
that a
correct
correct
analysis.
analysis, Mike?
In
Okay.
the minds of PLM folks is I released this, it's effective, it's going into production today. But the reality is it is you'd have a hard time affecting
Somebody
that
else.
production, that change in production on that day when it becomes effective.
Interesting. Okay. Very good.
So, Mike, that's kind of my last question on this first kind of round here is I know Arena has a very specific kind of customer they target. Like, are there industries, obviously in the manufacturing space, right? The kind of NAICS codes, those codes where customers are producing products. Are there areas where you and PLM fit really well, like all the time? It's like a no brainer, or like compliance or other heavily regulated industries that
Yeah.
matter?
So, top of the list, heavily regulated industries, because not only do you have to manage the product record, product definition, but you have to manage all of the procedures that go along with that and, meet all levels of compliance and display that you've met those levels of compliance because if you're regulated, there's going to be an auditor involved in the process, and you got to make sure that you've got those records available for an auditor to review, in that audit process. So regulated industries, absolutely top of the list. But anything that has a complex product record, right? So right off the top, high tech type products, whether it's just commercial product or if it's medical device or if it's defense related, right? Complex products where you've got mechanical, electrical, software, packaging, labeling, artwork, documentation, right? All feeding into the bill of materials for that product record. That's a great use case for PLM, right? If you have a simple product record, if you're making ballpoint pens or something like that, you may not need it, right? Although, even with
Right.
something, commercial like a ballpoint pen, packaging and documentation, all of that become fairly
Mhm.
complex in the product. We do have customers that make things like
Mhm.
shavers, right? And even though the razor
Right.
itself is simple, all of the packaging and labeling and little pieces of paper that go into that packaging, that all has to be managed and controlled and released, at a revision level where everything agrees that this is the release for that. So think of it as a complex product, and the easy thought is that you have this diversity of mechanical, electrical software, but then also think, what does your product record
Yeah.
look like? Is there a lot of stuff? And I think the key to it is different departments contributing to this product record that you need to maintain.
Makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Well, thanks, Mike. This has been a great introductory. On the next episode, Mike, we're going to talk about Arena specifically and what sets Arena apart. So look forward to discussing, your experience there and what you
Yeah, look
see
forward to
there.
it.
So thanks a lot, Mike.